In the northern ranges of Montana, where winter shadows stretch long across the frozen valleys, the Carr family had lived for more than a century. They were farmers, woodcutters, and shepherds of a land that seemed to resist change. But by the 1960s, only one man remained in that valley, and his figure stood out against the isolation like a relic that refused to vanish. His name was Samuel Carr. Samuel's presence carried an air of mystery for those who caught rare glimpses of him. His face bore a heavy asymmetry, as though the bones beneath had been carved by uneven hands. His back, curved and twisted, made him walk with a slow, uneven gait. The people in nearby towns spoke in hushed tones of his family, whispering that Samuel was the last bloodline of a lineage that had once sealed itself within the valley's walls. Few had ever dared to ask him directly. Born in the small wooden farmhouse where his parents and grandparents before him had lived, Samuel had never traveled farther than the ridgeline. Roads stretched outward, but they seemed to end for him the moment they reached the borders of his valley. Neighbors remembered his mother's silence, her eyes that avoided strangers. They recalled his father, a man who rarely left the barn and whose health had failed before Samuel was grown. By the time Samuel reached adulthood, he was alone. The valley itself became his keeper. Hemmed in by tall pines and narrow passes, it felt less like open land and more like a natural prison. Samuel tended sheep, grew hay, and kept a few chickens. His hands were calloused, his nails dark with soil, yet even with work, his body weakened year by year. When he could no longer rise at dawn to feed the livestock, his world shrank further. He spoke to no one save for the few who occasionally passed through the valley and saw his hunched frame against the dim glow of a lantern. What unsettled outsiders most was not his deformity, nor his solitude, but the sense that his life carried the weight of a family secret. He had lived in silence for so long that even the children of the nearby town believed him to be less a man than a living ghost. They whispered that the Carr family had closed itself away generations ago, bound by hidden ties that no one dared to name. And now Samuel, frail but unyielding, stood as the last remnant of that choice. By 1964, Samuel's body began to fail him in ways he could no longer ignore. Pain clutched his spine and his lungs grew heavy. For the first time in his life, he felt a force stronger than his fear of the outside world. He sought help. Samuel Carr, the man who had never left the valley, was about to step beyond its borders. It happened on a winter morning when the snow lay heavy across the ridges and the creek was frozen into silence. Samuel, worn thin by pain, placed on his back a coat that once belonged to his father. The seams were frayed, the collar bent with age, yet it was the only garment sturdy enough for the journey ahead. He took the narrow track leading out of the valley, each step a battle between fear and necessity. For decades, Samuel had watched the dirt road snake away toward towns he only knew by name. But on this day, his own boots pressed into the snow, leaving marks no Carr had left before him. His face was pale, his breath uneven, yet he walked with a strange determination that startled those who later recalled seeing him. Farmers working near the ridge said they stopped their plows to watch the bent figure pass, carrying nothing but a small satchel and the weight of a century-old name. When he reached the small town of Red Meadow, whispers preceded him. People had heard of the Carrs, but to see Samuel in the flesh, his slanted features, his twisted frame, was to see living proof of stories once dismissed as folklore. He entered the doctor's office with eyes lowered, his hands trembling as he removed his hat. For the first time, Samuel spoke openly of the pain that never left him, the weakness that made his mornings unbearable. His voice cracked as though unused to confession. The physician, a man named Dr. Ellsworth, studied him with a gaze that balanced compassion with unease. He asked about Samuel's parents, his grandparents, his family before them. Samuel answered in broken fragments, a father who died young, a mother who spoke little, relatives buried in the valley soil. Ellsworth's notes grew longer, his brow furrowed. Something in the way Samuel described his ancestry, closed, confined, never venturing outward, set the doctor's mind circling questions he dared not yet put into words. In town, rumors began to spread quickly. Children pressed their faces against frosted windows to watch Samuel limp past. Women whispered at the market about the last car, wondering aloud what secrets his body carried. The men shook their heads, uneasy but fascinated, as though Samuel embodied both tragedy and warning. One neighbor recalled how Samuel's eyes seemed both vacant and pleading, as if he carried not only his own suffering but the burden of generations. By evening, Samuel returned to a boarding room arranged by the doctor. He lay on a cot, staring at a ceiling he did not recognize, the walls pressing closer with every breath. For the first time, he was outside the valley, but instead of freedom, he felt the eyes of the world upon him, dissecting his life, his lineage, and the silence he had inherited. What Samuel did not know was that his first step outside had awakened questions that could no longer be buried. In the days that followed, Samuel's case became a quiet subject of fascination for Dr. Ellsworth. The doctor was no stranger to hardship in Montana: logging accidents, lung disease from the mines, the slow decay of rural poverty. But Samuel was different. His body seemed shaped by more than labor or bad luck. The curvature of his spine, the asymmetry of his face, and the weakness in his joints suggested something deeper, something written long before his birth. Ellsworth began to ask more pointed questions, couching them in gentle tones so as not to alarm the man before him. "Did your family often marry outside the valley?" he asked one morning, his pen hovering over the page. Samuel's eyes dropped to his hands. His silence stretched into the room until it became heavier than any spoken truth. Finally, he muttered, "No one left. No one came in. We had enough of our own." The answer chilled Ellsworth, though he concealed his reaction. He thought of textbooks he had studied in his youth, of hereditary illnesses that flourished in families closed too tightly upon themselves. The Carr lineage, it seemed, had been sealed by choice. Samuel was not merely an isolated farmer. He was the visible mark of generations who had turned away from the outside world. In town, the murmurs grew louder. A school teacher recalled finding an old newspaper clipping from the 1920s, describing the Carr family as reclusive stewards of the valley. The article noted that the family had refused offers to sell their land, that marriages always seemed to occur within the small circle of their own kin. No outsiders were ever welcomed. The discovery added weight to the rumors now spreading that Samuel's body carried the final proof of his family's hidden decisions. The doctor, disturbed by what he was uncovering, shared his concerns with a colleague in Missoula, a young geneticist who had begun studying hereditary conditions. The colleague urged him to gather more details, to create a family record if Samuel would allow it. But Ellsworth hesitated. Samuel was fragile, a man whose entire identity rested on silence and seclusion. To strip that away would be to expose him not only to medical scrutiny, but to the unforgiving eyes of the community. When Samuel sensed the doctor's probing interest, he grew wary. He answered less, his gaze distant, his shoulders curling inward as though to shield himself from exposure. Yet Ellsworth could not turn away. He felt that within Samuel's story lay not only a personal tragedy, but a reflection of what happens when generations build walls against the world. By the third week of Samuel's stay in town, a new layer of unease settled over Red Meadow. People no longer whispered only about the man himself. They wondered what his presence revealed about the land and the family that had kept him. The Carr Valley was no longer just a remote corner of Montana. It was becoming a symbol of something unspoken, a legacy sealed in shadows. The boarding house that sheltered him began to draw quiet visitors, curious faces who lingered at the edge of the hallway, hoping for a glimpse of the man whose very existence challenged their sense of normalcy. Samuel often sat by the window, his posture bent, the light casting his features in a way that made children whisper of shadows moving across his face. It was during this time that a story emerged, whispered first in the tavern and then carried like smoke through the town. An old trapper swore that he remembered another Carr, Samuel's supposed brother, who had left the valley decades earlier. According to the trapper, the man had traveled west, settled near Kalispell, and lived a long life free of deformities. The rumors spread quickly. Perhaps Samuel was not the last Carr after all. Perhaps the family's story had taken different turns beyond the valley, and the tragedy so many believed might not be as inevitable as it seemed. This possibility unsettled the townspeople. Some clung to it, eager to soften the dark narrative that was beginning to take shape. Others dismissed it outright, claiming the trapper's memory was clouded by age and whiskey. But for Samuel, the rumor struck with a peculiar force. A brother? He had no memory of one. His childhood had been marked by silence, his mother speaking little, his father already fading into sickness. Could it be that someone had escaped? That somewhere beyond the ridges there lived a man carrying the Carr name without the weight of his own twisted body? When Dr. Ellsworth brought the rumor to Samuel, hoping perhaps to lift him with a thread of hope, Samuel only lowered his gaze. "There was no one," he said firmly, his voice a rough whisper. "I was all they had left." His certainty silenced the room, yet doubt lingered like smoke. The schoolteacher who had uncovered the old newspaper clipping began digging deeper, scouring archives for any trace of another Carr outside the valley. Weeks of searching yielded nothing. The name appeared only within the boundaries of Samuel's birthplace, as though the land itself had swallowed generations whole. The supposed brother dissolved into nothing more than a false lead, a flicker of possibility extinguished by the weight of silence. Yet even as the rumor faded, it left behind a residue of unease. The people of Red Meadow no longer looked at Samuel as merely a man in pain. He was now seen as the embodiment of something larger, an unfinished story, half remembered, half denied. His frail body became a vessel onto which the town projected its fears, its doubts, and its own unspoken questions about how isolation reshapes blood and soul. Samuel himself retreated further into quiet, speaking less with each passing day, as though the mere act of being seen in this place had drained the strength from him. But the questions he had stirred could not be silenced. By early spring of 1965, those questions reached a breaking point. Dr. Ellsworth, compelled by both professional duty and a gnawing sense of responsibility, requested that Samuel undergo a full medical examination. Samuel resisted at first, his distrust deepening whenever instruments and papers surrounded him. But his body betrayed him, his pain worsening, his breathing shallow. Finally, with a slow nod, he agreed. The examination revealed more than Ellsworth had anticipated. Samuel's skeletal frame bore evidence of advanced curvature, his rib cage pressing against his lungs, his joints swollen and irregular. But what unsettled the doctor most were the signs that pointed beyond Samuel himself. The patterns of malformation suggested not just injury or disease, but a repeated inheritance. Ellsworth wrote carefully in his notes, "The condition appears consistent with generational confinement of lineage." He stopped short of words that might shame the man before him, but the truth weighed heavily on his mind. When Ellsworth explained part of his findings, he chose his words with restraint. "Your family," he began softly, "may have carried certain traits for many years. You are the one left to bear them. Samuel listened in silence, his face tightening, his knotted hands gripping the edges of his chair. After a long pause, he whispered, "It was always just us." That's how it was meant to be. His voice cracked, and for the first time, a glimmer of something raw, half defiance, half despair, passed through his eyes. Word of the doctor's conclusions did not remain confined to his office. Soon the town buzzed with speculation, filling the silence Samuel had guarded for decades. The whispers sharpened into pointed remarks, and neighbors debated openly whether the Carr legacy was a tale of endurance or of a forbidden bond that had doomed itself. At the boarding house, Samuel grew quieter still. He ate little, slept in restless fragments, and sometimes sat for hours staring at his father's coat folded on a chair. A boarding maid once saw tears run down his face as he pressed the old garment against his chest. She never told him she had seen. It was in this fragile state that Ellsworth made a difficult choice. He contacted a colleague in Helena, a psychiatrist known for his work with isolated families. He hoped that through measured conversation, Samuel might reveal more of his history and perhaps find some measure of peace in speaking it aloud. But Ellsworth also feared what might surface. The secrets Samuel had carried could break him if forced into light. When the psychiatrist arrived, Samuel refused at first to speak, but with patience the man drew from him fragments of memory: his mother's silence, his father's weak breath, the walls of the farmhouse that never echoed with laughter. As Samuel's words faltered into stillness, the psychiatrist closed his notebook with a grave expression. "Leave a comment if you believe truth must always be revealed, no matter how hidden." What followed that meeting would mark the darkest turn in Samuel's story. The psychiatrist, a reserved man named Dr. Kessler, had written his impressions in a private file. He noted Samuel's withdrawn demeanor, his fractured memories, and the eerie consistency of silence surrounding the Carr lineage. But what startled him most was Samuel's recollection of childhood moments that hinted at something unspoken. Doors locked at night, relatives who seldom left their rooms, whispers that stopped when he entered. The fragments painted no clear picture, yet the impression was unmistakable. A family held together by a pact of secrecy. When Ellsworth read Kessler's notes, a heaviness filled the room. The psychiatrist had written one line that froze the doctor's hand as he turned the page. The patient's life reflects the visible cost of generations choosing insularity over openness. His body is their history made flesh. Ellsworth set the file down, feeling the weight of what those words implied. But outside the world of medical files and private conclusions, Samuel's condition had become fuel for rumor. In Red Meadow, the whispers shifted from curiosity to judgment. People no longer wondered, they began to decide. Farmers muttered that the Carr family had brought it upon themselves. Women at the market spoke of Samuel's mother as though she had willfully carried shame. Children teased each other, daring one another to walk near the boarding house window where Samuel sometimes sat in the fading light. Samuel felt the change. Once the subject of quiet fascination, he now bore the full sting of suspicion. He rarely left his room except for appointments with Ellsworth. The doctor watched his patient retreat deeper into silence, each visit shorter, each answer thinner. Yet in one unguarded moment, Samuel revealed more than he intended. As Ellsworth adjusted his stethoscope, Samuel muttered almost to himself, "They always said the valley would never let us go. Even now it pulls me back." The doctor paused. "Do you feel it calls you?" he asked gently. Samuel did not answer. His eyes, clouded with a mixture of fear and longing, stared through the wall as if he could see the valley pressing in from miles away. Meanwhile, an old ledger surfaced in the county records office, discovered by a clerk sorting through forgotten boxes. Inside were land deeds signed by generations of Carrs, each one marked with the same address, the same valley. Not once in a century had the name shifted beyond its borders. The Carr family had anchored themselves to that soil as if bound by invisible chains. For Ellsworth and Kessler, the ledger confirmed what Samuel's body and silences had already testified. This was not accident, but legacy. And now, with Samuel as the last living heir, that legacy stood fully revealed. Too heavy for one man to bear, too haunting for the town to ignore. The burden became not only Samuel's, but Red Meadow's as well. By summer of 1965, the townspeople no longer treated him as a man among them, but as a living emblem of what had been hidden too long. Some pitied him, others scorned him, but all were drawn to the story his presence forced them to confront. It was as if the Carr family's long silence had been lifted from the valley and dropped into the streets of the town. It was then that a historian from Helena arrived, having heard whispers of Samuel's case through colleagues. Professor Albright was a man known for his research on pioneer families and the dangers of isolation in the rural West. He sought Samuel not out of idle curiosity, but with the urgency of someone who believed history was repeating itself in living form. Ellsworth arranged the meeting reluctantly, fearing the weight it would place on Samuel, but Albright came prepared, carrying folders of census records, burial lists, and scraps of letters long buried in archives. He spread them across the table in Ellsworth's office, and as Samuel sat silently in the corner, the historian spoke in a low, measured voice. For nearly a century, the Carr name had appeared only within one narrow tract of land. Records showed cousins marrying cousins, households never registering new surnames. A letter written in 1912, signed by a Carr patriarch, declared the valley self-sufficient and untainted by the outside. The words, yellowed with time, seemed to echo through Samuel's bent frame. Samuel listened without protest, but his breathing grew heavier, his eyes fixed on the table as though the weight of those papers pressed against his chest. Finally, he whispered, "They told me the valley was enough. They told me we were safe there." His voice cracked and he turned his face away, unwilling to meet the historian's eyes. Albright, though seasoned in his work, felt a chill pass through him. He had studied cases of closed bloodlines before, but never had he seen the living cost sitting before him. Fragile and trembling, he closed his folders gently, as though even the paper carried a kind of curse. News of the historian's findings spread quickly once again. The valley was spoken of not as land, but as a graveyard of choice, a place where a family had bound itself into silence and decay. Some townspeople grew angry, declaring that the Carrs had defied nature and now Samuel was paying the price. Others whispered of pity, saying no man should carry the sins of generations upon his body. Samuel heard it all. In the quiet of his room, he touched the old scars along his ribs, marks of his twisted bones pressing from within, and he wondered if he was cursed to carry not only his pain but the voices of the dead. In the dim boarding room, those voices began to feel closer than the living. Samuel often woke in the night, clutching his chest, convinced he could hear the creak of his family's farmhouse walls, the muffled coughs of his father, the endless silence of his mother. Though miles away, the valley seemed to seep into him, refusing to release its claim. Meanwhile, Red Meadow itself grew divided. Some argued that Samuel should be taken back to his land, left to fade where his bloodline had begun. Others insisted he remain in care, that his condition demanded intervention. The debate reached the county seat, where officials quietly discussed whether neglect of duty had allowed the Carr family's suffering to continue unchallenged for so long. The question hung heavy. Had the state turned its back on an isolated family, allowing them to collapse inward without aid? A social worker from Helena, Mrs. Hartley, came forward to assess Samuel's situation. She listened to Ellsworth, reviewed Kessler's notes, and spoke gently to Samuel himself. To her, the tragedy was not only his body, but the failure of institutions that should have reached the valley long ago. "We left him there," she told the board. "We left them all there to vanish behind the pines." Her words carried the sting of accusation, and for the first time, the county officials admitted a measure of guilt. But guilt did little to change Samuel's life. His health faltered further. Each step was a struggle. His chest rattled with shallow breaths, and his once calloused hands trembled when lifting even the smallest glass. Yet his eyes, clouded though they were, still carried a strange defiance. When Hartley suggested he be moved permanently to Helena for treatment, Samuel shook his head. "The valley waits," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was born there. I will end there." His words unsettled the room. To the officials, it sounded like surrender. To Ellsworth, it sounded like fate. For Samuel, it was neither. It was an anchor, his last tie to a place that had shaped and scarred him. The community followed his decline with morbid fascination. Each rumor of his worsening health spread quickly until Samuel became less a man than a mirror, reflecting questions no one wished to answer. Was he the victim of his family's choices or of a society that turned its head from suffering hidden in plain sight? In that debate, judgment and pity intertwined, leaving no clear verdict. Samuel lay awake one night, the boarding house creaking around him, and felt the pull of the valley stronger than ever. He whispered into the darkness, "You never let me go." Those words, overheard by the maid who tended his room, spread quickly through the boarding house. To some, they sounded like the delirium of a dying man. To others, they were a confession that Samuel had never truly escaped the valley, no matter how many miles he put between himself and its soil. By autumn, Samuel's condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. His breathing rattled like loose wood in a storm, his hands skeletal, his body curled into itself. Dr. Ellsworth visited daily, his once clinical notes giving way to personal grief. "He is slipping," he wrote quietly in his journal, "but he holds to the valley as if it were life itself." The county debated again what to do with him. Some officials urged he be moved to a state facility, declaring his care a burden too heavy for the town. Others, shamed by Hartley's earlier words, resisted, arguing that abandoning Samuel in his final days would only deepen the failure already written across decades. In the body end, no resolution came. Samuel remained where he was, between the world that judged him and the valley that pulled at him. It was Hartley who sat with him one late evening when his strength nearly failed. She placed her hand on his twisted fingers, her voice steady. "You are not your valley, Samuel," she said. His lips parted in a faint smile that carried both sorrow and refusal. "It made me," he whispered. "It will take me." Her report, submitted weeks later, did not mask her anger. She wrote that Samuel's life revealed a silence cultivated not only by one family but by an entire region that chose not to see. "We failed him," her words concluded, just as surely as his own blood did. The county filed the report away, stamped, signed, and forgotten. In November, Samuel's body finally gave in. He passed quietly in the night, no kin at his side. Only the soft sound of wind through the cracks of the boarding house window. His death certificate listed respiratory failure, but those who had witnessed his life knew it was more than lungs that had collapsed. It was a century of solitude that ended in one final breath. When word reached the valley, only the pines bore silent witness. The farmhouse, long abandoned, leaned further into decay. Neighbors passing on the ridge said the windows looked like hollow eyes, watching the road Samuel had once taken out and never returned upon. The Carr bloodline was finished, but the story it left behind unsettled Montana long after. In the years that followed Samuel's death, the Carr Valley became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Curious travelers, drawn by whispers of the last heir, would hike through the pine-lined ridges to glimpse the farmhouse where generations had sealed themselves away. They found it sagging into the earth, the roof broken, the porch leaning like a tired body. Wind moved through the gaps in the wood, carrying with it the scent of rot and pine sap, as though the house itself breathed with the last remnants of the family it had sheltered. Historians spoke of Samuel as a symbol, proof of what happens when silence becomes law within bloodlines. Professors used his case in lectures about isolation, about the fragile balance between tradition and stagnation. His name appeared in journals, his photograph sometimes printed beside words like legacy, heritage, and closure. Yet none of those words captured the reality of the man who once sat by the boarding house window, staring into a world that judged but never understood him. In Red Meadow, his memory lingered in smaller ways. The boarding maid who had seen him weep kept the secret of his tears until her death. Dr. Ellsworth never spoke of Samuel again, but in his drawer remained the notes, clinical lines broken by sentences that revealed a rare grief. Mrs. Hartley continued her work, carrying Samuel's story as a warning in every case she touched, reminding communities that turning away from hidden suffering only deepens its scars. The farmhouse, though, told the truest story. Its windows cracked and broken, its walls bowed inward. It became a skeleton of wood, bearing silent witness to a family that had refused to leave its soil. In the winters, snow gathered through the collapsed roof, burying the rooms in white silence. In the summers, weeds climbed the walls, swallowing what remained. Each season layered another shroud over the house until it seemed less a dwelling than a grave. Travelers who stood before it often described the same sensation, that the valley was not empty, but watching. Some claimed they heard whispers on the wind, low and indecipherable, as if the voices of the Carrs still clung to the trees. Others swore they saw movement in the windows at dusk, a shadow bent at the frame, waiting for someone who would never return. The Carr bloodline ended with Samuel, but the valley never let him go. Its silence became his monument, its decay his headstone. And as the farmhouse finally collapsed into itself, leaving only splintered beams and a hollow foundation, the land whispered its final truth. Some legacies do not vanish, they sink into the soil, waiting for those who dare to listen.